Tourists in Paris can get a bird's-eye view of the City of Light once again, and French tourism is getting a much-needed boost. The top floor of the Eiffel Tower and Disneyland Paris are back open. NBC News foreign correspondent Kelly Cobiella reports.
Hey, Allison. Well, after weeks of lockdown, some tourists in Europe are slowly starting to venture out, and they're finding that European cities look very different this summer. In some cases, not all the hotels are open, not all the restaurants are open, but in Paris, one big sign of progress. France celebrating Bastille Day this week, the country's national holiday. And in another sign things are getting back to normal, the very top of the Eiffel Tower also back in business. With strict social distancing, of course, no more than 250 people allowed up top at any time. Tourism brings more than 30 million visitors to France in a normal year. The Eiffel Tower, one of the biggest attractions. Our Molly Hunter was there when the tower partially reopened last month to sample the excitement.
Now, the only way up to the second floor, 675 grueling steps. The elevators open up later this week, but the exercise is worth it.
Now, 6 weeks after lockdown ended, Parisians and brave tourists excited. Other landmarks coming back to life, Disneyland Paris, partially reopening. And next week, the country's most famous export, the Statue of Liberty, also set to reopen with its own social distancing plans. While back in Paris, the city of love, some residents having trouble following orders. Pretty tough to do that at Disneyland Paris. Masks are required at the theme park, and so are reservations.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.